Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterism Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And on Fridays, I call this my responding to the critics section. Virtually every Friday, I do a video responding to someone who has either written a book, as is the case with the book that we're looking at right now, Problems with Preterism by Brian Hodge, or a blog or an article or, something along that line in which they condemn covenant eschatology, i.e. full preterism, as heretical. Now, I've done a lot of these, and as I have suggested to you, I'm not examining every single thing that Mr. Hodge claims in his book. That would involve 200 videos, and I'm not going to do that. And there's not any need for that. What I'm doing is addressing some of the fundamental arguments that he makes. And the reason for that is if I demonstrate that Mr. Hodge's fundamental argument, for instance, last week, I shared with you how Mr. Hodge claims that Jesus shared the common Jewish expectation of the first century. And I pointed out how Mr. Hodge appeals to the Dead Sea community and what they believed. He appeals to the Maccabees and what they believed. He appeals to other rabbinic and Jewish writings of the time about what they believed and says, see, Jesus was a Jew. He must have believed what all these other sources, common sources in the first century believed. Therefore, Jesus' eschatological expectation was literalistic, physical, nationalistic. Well, that's a horrible leap in logic. And it's a logical fallacy, especially when we consider, as I pointed out last week, Jesus absolutely 100% rejected the common Jewish expectation, eschatological expectation of the day. They wanted an earthly kingdom. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." They wanted a literal physical king on the literal throne of David in Jerusalem. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world, or else my servants would fight." They, the Jews, Qumran community, the rabbis, the Pharisees, they all wanted the Messiah's army to fight. And Jesus said, "No, my followers are not going to do that." And so, in demonstrating that this fundamental element and argument of Mr. Hodge is absolutely false, then essentially it destroys his entire interpretation, for instance, of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And here's one of the reasons why. He appeals to the book of Maccabees. And in the book of Maccabees, you have a very graphic description of the martyrdom of some of the Maccabean brothers. And their mother expressed a devout expectation that in the resurrection they were going to get their physical bodies back. And so, once again, Mr. Hodge goes, see, that was the Jewish expectation. That must be what Paul's writing about in 1 Corinthians 15. Here's this woman expecting physical resurrection of physical bodies. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is talking about the resurrection of the body. He must be talking about the same kind of body that this Maccabean woman was. Wrong. The fact that Jesus, and thus Paul, rejected the common Jewish eschatological expectation of the day falsifies this fundamental element of Mr. Hodge's book. Now, I want to turn my attention to one of my very favorite passages in the New Testament that demonstrates the fallacy of Mr. Hodge's, actually his entire book. Actually, it destroys his entire book. And that's 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. Now, I wrote a book on 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 a good little while back. This book has had a profound impact on thousands of people. I have had people contact me, ministers, professors, and tell me that this is one of the finest books on biblical hermeneutic that they have ever seen. Yes, college professors. So, Paul said, writing to the Thessalonians 2,000 years ago, said, it is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation. Now, he uses the word thalipsis. Thalipsis is used some 45 times in the New Testament, if my count is correct. In all but a tiny, tiny handful of cases, thalipsis refers to persecution for the cause of Christ. Now, in John chapter 16, it is used of pressure of childbirth. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, as Paul discusses the contribution for the brethren in Judea experiencing famine and horrible, horrible circumstance, writing to the Corinthians, who to a great extent are Gentiles, and he's taking up a contribution from the Gentiles to send to their Jewish brethren there in Jerusalem. And in Romans chapter 16, he said, brethren, I want you to pray that this contribution will be accepted. Why? Well, because Gentiles had never given to Jews before. Never. So anyway, I get kind of wrapped up in all that because it's so fascinating. So, Paul said, I do not mean that you or others should be burdened and you be relieved, or vice versa. Burden there is thalipsis. So Paul said, when I've written to you concerning this contribution and urged you to do it, I wasn't trying to burden you so that others could be relieved. Greek word anesis. That's a couple of examples of exceptions to the Greek use of the Greek word thalipsis. It normally means persecution. Well, we know what the persecution of the Thessalonians was. From Acts chapter 17, here's the church established in the synagogue among the Jews, but many of the Jews who did not believe stirred up the really disreputable men of the marketplace, the agora, and started persecuting the Christians from the synagogue, casting them out of the synagogue. So that's the background. We'll have more to say about it probably momentarily, if not next week. So here's Paul saying it's a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation, with pressure, those who are troubling you. Well, once again, who was it that was troubling them? Well, Mr. Hodge makes an argument here. Others have tried to use it. Steve Gregg used it in my formal public debate with him in Denver, Colorado, some years ago. He says, Mr. Hodge does, notice that the suffering and persecution of the Thessalonians is by the hand of their own countrymen, hupoton idion symphileton, by your own ethnicity, not the Jews. Now, I find this absolutely incredible. I have to confess, when I read his comment, I was going, you got to be kidding me. The church at Thessalonica was established where and by whom? By Paul, good faithful Jew, established in the synagogue of the Jews. It was a Jewish church. Did it have Gentile? Did it have pagan members? Yes, I'm not denying that. I'm not suggesting otherwise in any way, shape, form, or fashion. I'm simply saying that it was established in the Jewish synagogue by Jews, and many Jews believed, in addition to Grecian women, in addition to Greeks. So it was comprised of Jews. The Jewish unbelievers are the ones that stirred up the persecution. Now, did they go to the marketplace and get some pagans to help them? Yes, they did. I'm not denying that. Who were the instigators? It's really interesting to me that Mr. Hodge relies on the word symphiliton and insists that it has to mean own ethnicity. Well, okay, let's grant that for a minute. I don't have a major problem with that. But it goes back to the issue: who established the church? Paul, a Jew, and his entourage, Jews. And they established the church in the Jewish synagogue. The very first converts were Jews. Who stirred up the persecution? Jews. Who instigated the persecution? Jews. You know, Steve Gregg said, well, you know, Don, it says, you suffered the same things from your countrymen. That must mean the Gentiles. Well, that must mean that none of the Jews were their countrymen. Folks, this is argumentum ad desperatum. But because Mr. Hodge is building his entire building his entire argument on symphiliton having to mean own ethnicity, claiming that it cannot refer to Jews when it obviously did refer to Jews, his whole house crumbles, ladies and gentlemen. Listen, you have to be able to prove that the church was not established among or in the Jewish synagogue, and that there were no Jewish converts. And you have to be able to prove that although the text emphatically says that some of the unbelieving Jews stirred up the persecution, that it really wasn't the Jews at fault after all. So you got to be able to prove all of that. This is literally argumentum ad desperatum. But let's look a little closer at the text. And I'm already running out of time. I'll try to keep this to about 20 minutes. Paul cites, pardon me. Well, let me start over. Pardon me. It is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who are. Now that's a present active. Whoever it was that was persecuting the Thessalonian church at that very time were going to have the tables turned on them, and they would receive persecution, thlipsis, when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven. Now watch this. It is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who are troubling you, and to give to you who are being tribulated relief from anesis. And anesis doesn't mean heaven. Anesis means relief from pressure. And look, folks, I have an in-depth examination and linguistic study of how thlipsis and onesis are used as antonyms. When thlipsis is used in a context, along with onesis invariably, without exception, means relief from whatever kind of pressure was being applied. Now, what that means is the Thessalonians were being pressured through persecution. Paul said the Thessalonians, living 2,000 years ago, would receive relief from that then ongoing, that then present active persecution. And he said they would receive that onesis, that relief, when the Lord Jesus is revealed. In other words, folks, two facts. The persecutors would be persecuted. Those persecutors who were then actively persecuting the Thessalonians would be persecuted when the Lord Jesus would be revealed. In other words, the persecutors had to be alive at the time of the parousia. Likewise, Paul said, it is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who are troubling you, and to give to you who are being tribulated relief when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven. When would the then present persecutors get persecution? When the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven. When would the Thessalonian Christians being persecuted, when would they receive relief? When the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven. I'm sorry, folks. There's no escape from this language. You know what? In one sense, even if you granted, I don't, obviously, but even if you granted that the reference to your own countrymen was reference to the Gentiles persecuting the church, I've already explained that. No sense going over it again. But even if you were to grant it, it doesn't negate the fact that Paul said the persecutors and the persecuted would have the tables turned, and the persecutors would become the persecuted, and the persecuted would become they wouldn't become the persecutors, but they would receive relief from that persecution when the Lord Jesus would be revealed from heaven. And here's what that means. If the persecutors did not become persecuted, and if the persecuted did not receive relief, in that first century generation, it means that Paul's prediction, it means that Paul's promise to the Thessalonians failed. Once again, I'm sorry. You cannot pervert the language. You cannot distort Paul's promise to say, well, you know, Thessalonians, I know that you're being persecuted. I know it's a terrible thing, and you're liable to die for your faith. But one of these millennia, you know, thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years from now, the Lord Jesus is going to come back and he's going to give you relief. Wait a minute, folks. The Thessalonians had to be under persecution. They had to be being, present active, persecuted when the Lord Jesus would be revealed. There is no escape from this. It is irrefutable. I got to share with you very quickly, and I'm out of time basically, but I do have two other points that I will pick up on next week to drive this point home. When I was in seminary, on the very first day of our study of Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, our professor walked in and he said, fellas, I've got to tell you, I've got a real severe problem. And we're going, what would that be? And someone, I don't know who it was, I'm sure it wasn't me, being I'm such a quiet, shy, withdrawn type of fellow, don't you know? Anyway, someone asked, well, Brother Stewart, what do you mean you've got a problem with this text? He said, well, brethren, here's the deal. He said the Thessalonians were being persecuted by the Jews, according to Acts chapter 17. And Paul promised the Thessalonians that they were going to get relief from that persecution when the Lord came. I mean, he nailed it. But he said, the problem is, I know the Lord didn't come. He said, brother, we got a problem here, and I don't know what the solution is. And guys started going, oh, no, that can't be right. Surely that can't be right. Well, it is right. And in subsequent years, as I looked closer at the prophetic background of 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, which I'll cover next week, as I looked at the actual historical context, as I looked at the Greek text, I knew without any shadow of a doubt that professor was right. I never had the opportunity to share with him what I've written in this book. Folks, let me urge that you get a copy of this book. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. And look, what I'm going to do, you might not want to order it immediately. I hate to say that, but I'm going to have another 2-book special for the month of February, 2025, U.S. orders only. And in that 2-book special, I'm going to include a copy of this book. So it's going to be a 3-book special, and it's going to save you a lot of money. So be watching for it. It will be coming next week. In the meantime, thank you for joining me on this morning's Morning Musings and responding to the critics. Listen to me. Just based on what I shared with you this morning, based on the misuse of the text by Mr. Brian Hodge, by ignoring Acts chapter 17, by ignoring the whole context of 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, Mr. Hodge has destroyed his own book. Thanks again for joining me. Hope to see you on Monday.